Good evening. I'm Derek Fuldebrandt, publisher of the Western Standard. Thank you for joining us this Tuesday evening for another edition of Danielle Smith Uncensored. Today we have a great show on the Deplatformed doctors. Before I kick it over to Danielle, really quickly, I want to remind everyone it's important that if you don't support government bailout media, you need to support independent alternative media. Western Standard doesn't take a penny of government support for what we do, so please go to westernstandardonline.com/membership. Become a member. You get, if you buy a whole year, you get the first 2 months for free. You can just try the whole thing with a 15-day trial and get unlimited access to all the Western Standard content we're producing. Special note, we're going to be expanding very soon to British Columbia with some great new contributors and reporters there, really to be truly the Western Standard, not the Alberta Plus Standard. So please support us, become a member. I'm just going to kick it straight away. You're not here to hear me. You're here to hear Danielle and the doctors. So Danielle, thanks for coming on today.
My pleasure. Thank you so much again for hosting us on this, Derek. I know Derek is going to go in backstage, and we're going to have a great conversation tonight with our three doctors. I just want to start off by noting that today's podcast is sponsored by Chiron's Way. Consulting Penny at Chiron's Way is a certified natural nutritionist, health math interventions practitioner, and emotional health skills counselor who offers an affordable and educational-based approach to address a variety of emotional health-related needs, including stress and anxiety. You can get your free nutritional and stress assessments online at www.chironsway.com. Now, you'll be happy to know I finally set my computer up so I can monitor all your comments as they're coming in. So lots of thank yous for doing this show, and thank you so much for tuning in. I wanted to do this episode in particular because, as you know, I felt like I had to do a little bit of conscience clearing after my experience in mainstream media. And two of the doctors, we've called this tonight the deplatformed doctors, and they've all objected. They say, I've not been deplatformed. I still have a voice. And so let me explain why I've called them deplatformed doctors. In the case of Dr. Dennis Modry, I did ask if I was able to have him on my show after he wrote his first column in the Western Standard. I was told I could not. I also asked if I could have Dr. Roger Hodkinson on my show after he gave his presentation to City Council in Edmonton, and I was told I could not. I have not met Dr. Patrick Phillips, but he is in a universe where he is in touch with those who are also facing various degrees of potential threats to their professional careers, as well as deplatforming. So it's very true that these kind of alternative media have an opportunity to get an alternative message out. We'll have to talk with Derek afterwards about whether this needs to be posted somewhere else, because I think Dr. Hodkinson has a bit of a, I think he said he's managed to get everything deplatformed that he's been on in various major markets, and I think he's going to try to do it again tonight. But we're going to see if we can at least get this information out to you, and hopefully it will survive Jack Dorsey and Mark Zuckerberg and Sundar Pichai, but you never know. That's one of the issues that I've been facing, and I'll talk to the doctors about that as well. But I want you to know who they are, why we're talking to them. We wanted to make sure, I mean, I don't, as you know, I love the whole broad spectrum of health professionals. I do yoga myself, so I understand that those of you who like to have alternative practitioners really swear by it. But we wanted to put this show together with sort of conventional mainstream doctors, just so that you understood that there are conventional mainstream doctors as well who are concerned with the approach that government has taken in its management of COVID. I also am seeing from some of the comments that many of you are so frustrated with the announcement yesterday. I think many of you were expecting that we would move to step 3, and I would like your feedback on that. We'll share some of your questions. I don't want to spend too much time hogging the mic tonight. I know you guys know that I'm highly capable of doing that, and I often do it, but I want to see if I can get as many of your questions posed to the doc so that we can get a perspective that just isn't really widely available elsewhere. So keep your questions coming. I will keep an eye on this, and I will summarize with, I'll watch with one eye and summarize with my pen and make sure that we are able to cover all of the issues off. So let me start by telling you who, I want to give give each of the docs an opportunity to just tell us who they are, to establish their credentials. Because one of the issues that we face is that there's a challenge to their credentials when they put their name forward, saying, oh, well, he doesn't know anything about this, that, or the other thing. So I want to make sure that you know who you're talking to and the long history that they have in the medical profession. I was making a joke that I couldn't read through their resumes because we would be here literally all night, just as I was printing off Dr. Dennis Modry's resume, and it's over 60 pages long. So I stopped partway through, and I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Dennis Modry to just tell us a little bit about his history of practice, and then we'll get some opening statements from the others as well. Dr. Modry, tell us a little bit about who you are.
Sure. Happy to, Danielle, and delighted that Patrick and Roger are on the call as well. It would have been lovely to have Ari Jaffe with us as well. In any event, I went to medical school here in Edmonton and did my BSc and my MD here. And at 23, I left then for Montreal and spent 8 years at McGill training in general surgery and cardiovascular and thoracic surgery, critical care, and I did a master's in experimental surgery. And before I tell you the next part, I should back up and say that before I was in medicine, I was doing lung transplants on dogs. So then that leapfrogs to the next part of my career was when I went to Stanford. And I spent 3 years at Stanford doing immunology, and high-risk cardiac surgery, and was the transplant chief there for a year, at which time I performed some 23 transplants while at Stanford, which all of that gave me the credibility to come back to Canada, and specifically to Alberta, which I love, and set up Western Canada's first heart and lung transplantation program. And for the majority of the next 30 years, I directed the heart and lung transplant program, as well as the cardiovascular intensive care unit. So my involvement with immunology and infectious disease was virtually on a daily basis. And but having said that, it was a tremendous privilege to work with extremely bright people in many fields, but in particular in infectious disease as well. So whereas you learn a lot as you go through your training, you also learn a lot while you're in practice from your colleagues as well.
Dr. Modry, let me pause you on that because I know you're probably about to say some nice things about Dr. Hodkinson. I'm getting some feedback, Chris tells me. My mic is muted, so I don't know if Dr. Hodkinson and Dr. Phillips, if perhaps you can mute your mics just because of the way the speaker works. We might be getting some feedback. We'll see if we can solve that now.
Can't hear you.
So continue on, Dr. Modry. I have to know.
I was sort of finished. I was just, to reiterate, the last part was it was just a privilege to work with so many very bright people in immunology and infectious disease. And you can't help but, even though I had a tremendous amount of training and experience in the area, you can't help but learn along the way. And it kind of is the segue to, even though I'm retired now, I've maintained a keen interest in many aspects of healthcare and life in general and politics and whatnot. And the understanding of what has happened with healthcare and with the way in which COVID-19 has been addressed has really compelled me to sort of rekindle my interest, if you will, in what's going on in the world and see whether or not I can help make a difference, which was the genesis of why I wrote the letter to the Premier, which, as you know, he has now responded to. So in a way, I haven't been deplatformed. But I am going to respond to it, and I've started.
Good. In a way, you've got a really big platform, because as soon as the politicians start engaging with you, everybody pays attention. So I can't wait to see how that goes. Thank you for the introduction, Dr. Modry. We'll now go to Dr. Roger Hodkinson to get a little bit of his background as well, and what brings him to this issue. You know, Dr. Hodkinson, it was almost like it was some kind of secretly recorded audio tape of your testimony that then got posted surreptitiously onto various websites websites. That's how I initially heard it, which is why I wanted to have you on, because I thought, I'm pretty sure that this doc has more than 5 minutes worth of testimony to say. But it was sort of strange the way it almost was like a bootleg copy of your comments, bizarrely. And I want to give you to give some background about why it is you chose to give that testimony to Edmonton City Council that day. Have we got Dr. Hodkinson? Are we frozen? Dr. Hodkinson, we can't hear you. I don't know if we can get some technical support in the background there. We might have you on mute. We got you now?
Can you hear me?
Yeah, lean forward and see if we're getting closer to the mic solves it. Go ahead.
Well, yes, I took the opportunity of making a presentation from Edmonton City Council on what they call the mask mandate. I felt very strongly about this whole mess, not just with masks, but in general, as I'm sure we'll get into. And never in my wildest dreams did I expect it to go viral internationally, which resulted in a great deal of involvement in interviews and other presentations in Europe and in the States. So I'm not new to controversial issues, and the media leading role 30 odd years ago in the fight against big tobacco, which is still killing in the States 500,000 people a year. So I consider myself educated in the trenches of public health, having lobbied and both provincially and nationally and internationally on the subject. I know the issues of public health. And when the college tries to demean me in terms of the scope of practice that they think is appropriate for me, I take that very personally. Snopes has tried to, and AP have tried to misinterpret my credentials. But in summary, I'm a pathologist for your viewers. Pathologists don't do autopsies all day long, by the way. We're the guys in the back rooms giving Dr. Modry all the numbers that helps him manage his patients. That's what pathologists do. We relate to all specialities, including infectious disease. We're trained in virology and certain aspects of public health. So my training started in Cambridge, in the UK. I came here in 1970 when all that was needed was a negative chest X-ray. I trained in pathology in Vancouver, which was an excellent residency program. I've had an academic position. I've done lots of teaching. I've been involved in Royal College work. I've been president of our section of the Medical Association. I've done lots of stuff in medicine, not as, I haven't been cutting out, what was it, Dennis, you were cutting out? Lungs, right?
Like hearts and lungs. Lungs out of dogs.
Hearts and lungs, yeah. Yeah, we were doing lung preservation.
I was going to be an experimental pathologist years ago, and I was doing partial hepatectomies on rats. So that's the only similarity I have with Dr. Modry, I think. But that didn't come to much. So yes, I'm outraged about all of this, despite the college attacking me for my statements, and I bring sufficient expertise to add information for the general public, which is being sorely lacking.
I'm grateful to you for that. Thank you so much. And we'll get into some of the issues in just a moment. We've got Dr. Patrick Phillips, who is with us as well. So Doc, why don't you tell us a little bit about your history and your practice?
Yeah, thank you for having me on. I did my medical training at Dalhousie Medicine, New Brunswick. And after that, I finished my my family medicine residency in 2018 in Toronto. And from there, I've spent the last 3 years mostly doing locums throughout rural Ontario, working mostly in emergency departments, but also doing some hospice and some office work as well, and a little bit of dabbling in ICU. But I mean, I'd say I don't have the I don't have a ton of experience in research or in specialized areas, but I can tell you for sure that I guess a doctor who works on the front lines of healthcare in the emergency department in a small town, I've seen so many of the harms that have come from these lockdowns, and it was seeing all of that that just led my conscience to know that I needed to speak out, that something was going wrong, the harms were outweighing the benefits, and I think I can definitely speak to that and how people were being thrown under the bus by these lockdowns.
Dr. Phillips, let's start there. Did you have any COVID patients? I mean, I want to firmly establish what COVID does in sort of the normal environment, as well as what leads to hospitalization, as well as sadly what leads to death. Have you had any patients who've had some of those extreme outcomes?
I personally have not, no. So I've had a few COVID patients. Some of them have been hospitalized, but most of them have done well. I've worked mostly in Northern Ontario, where we have been fortunate to not have a lot of cases. It's spreading a little more up there now, so we are seeing more for sure. But yeah, honestly, not a lot. And I wouldn't say that was on its own what led me to speak out. It was more seeing the consequences from the lockdowns, because we underwent some of the same lockdowns as Toronto did, and it was devastating.
Okay, let's go to Dr. Modry, and I just want to get all of your assessment of COVID-19. So SARS-CoV-2, the virus, and COVID-19, the disease that it causes. Because I was watching some of the testimony from doctors in emergency rooms in New York, for instance. Kyle Cameron Siddell was one that I watched, and he painted a very troubling picture of blood clotting, the appearance of altitude sickness because of low oxygen levels, the congestion in the lungs, and how the X-rays were cloudy. And then, of course, we've seen, obviously, the deaths that have resulted. So I want to just get your assessment, Dr. Modry, of how this respiratory disease is different from other respiratory viruses that we've seen.
Well, from my perspective, and I think Roger can weigh in on this as well, particularly as a pathologist, but clinically, when someone has pneumonia, whether it's viral, bacterial, fungal, rickettsial, it doesn't matter, they're often going to go ahead and have a problem with ventilation and oxygenation, so retention of CO2 and low oxygen levels. One of the things that seems to have occurred with COVID-19 is that, as you well know, it seems to have a predilection for people who are not only elderly, but who have also comorbid conditions. And so, and I guess that shouldn't be so surprising, because in general, as we get older, our immune system is not as robust as it is when we're younger, which partially, to a large extent, I believe explains why younger people are far more resistant to the disease, to dying from COVID-19 than others. Having said that, I mean, I'm encouraged by the advances that have been made with respect to the treatment of COVID-19 as well, which, and I know we'll get into this at some point, which is going to raise the question of, do you really need a vaccine? But from a clinical perspective, people come in, and don't forget, I haven't been in practice, but I've certainly seen the chest röntgenograms. I've seen the analyses of people who are ill with COVID-19, and it would be very similar to someone who is extremely ill as well from another form of respiratory virus from which they may or may not survive.
Okay.
But Roger would like to expand on that.
Yeah, definitely. Let me ask Dr. Hodkinson about this. And I don't know, I'm just speaking to our behind the scenes guy. If there's a way of us putting who we are on the screens, I think you can put our titles. I've got a few people asking, who's speaking now? Who's speaking now? So there you go. Thanks so much for doing that. So Dr. Hodkinson, if you can just sort of jump off where Dr. Modry left off and just tell us what, if you were still in practice and this disease arrived, what are some of the distinguishing features that make it different? Because we've often been told it's the novel coronavirus. And so what is novel about this?
Well, first of all, can you hear me clearly? Because I've been having a lot of chopping in that. That's fine. Well, let me paint the big picture here. First of all, I'm not a clinician. But I can say this, I think, with some certainty. If I could borrow, there's no there. This is, in the grand scheme of things, a minor infection. The vast majority of the population are simply, the working well, as I call them, they are not dying in any larger numbers than they have with previous flu epidemics. The essence of this matter is to protect the vulnerable, the elderly in nursing homes, as described in the Great Barrington Declaration by 3 esteemed international epidemiologists, who basically said nothing needs to be done except focused protection for that group of people. Those people are in essentially self-quarantined locations called nursing homes. They're outdoors. All that needs to be done is to protect them in ways that are very established with infection control. Manuals on the shelves that do exactly that. Testing is not required for anyone except people in sufficient distress that they may need to be admitted to hospital. Asymptomatic testing has been an absolute disaster. Massive numbers of false positives. Then the contacts of those people get taken out of the workforce as well, resulting in a huge knock-on effect of the false positive results. So it's essentially, this is, again, to borrow a phrase from American politics, this is a nothing burger. It's really not that much more serious than previous flu epidemics. It's killing somewhat more elderly people with comorbidities, but not a massive number. And so you have to ask yourself, why are we doing this internationally if the working well are not dying in any greater numbers than they have with the flu? We simply don't need any protection of any kind for the working well. If you're sick, you stay at home. You give it to your family, and that builds herd immunity. It's excellent transmission of a natural infection that's the whole virus, and you're not needing a vaccine at all. So in summary, this is a non-issue. It's been massively distorted by politicians playing medicine. The working well need no protection. Lockdowns have no purpose. The harm that they're creating is vastly greater than the benefit. And the vaccine is reckless, in my opinion. It's being foisted on people as the only alternative to taking the dogs off with the mandates. The vaccine is experimental. It's not being subjected to the usual 2 to 4 year rigorous effects. It's the biggest medical experiment in history, going into when there's no evidence for that. I'm not an anti-vaxxer. I take pneumococcal vaccine, I take the flu vaccine and so on. I'm not an anti-vaxxer. I'm an evidence-based physician who's lived his entire career that way. And what's going on politically, in my opinion, if it was translated into medical practice, negligence. If I was doing things that hurt more people than it benefited, or if I was giving them stuff which is certainly not happening with the vaccine, if I was doing either of those two things, I would be in jeopardy of losing my license.
Doc, let me pause you for a minute. I wonder if we turn off your video, if we might. You were almost perfect most of the time, but there are a couple of moments where you cut in and out. We got the message, but maybe I'll just see if we turn off your camera, if your audio comes through perfectly clear. Let me go to Dr. Patrick Phillips and get him to weigh in and build on what you've said, and then we'll do another round here. But Dr. Phillips, maybe you can tell us your take on it. Here's the way I've looked at this, and I'm going to quote Dr. Dina Hinshaw in how she described this as the numbers were coming more clear, is that those who are under or over the age of 70 with pre-existing conditions have a much higher rate of a bad outcome than influenza. Those who are between 40 and 70, it's about the same as influenza. And her term was that the risk is vanishingly small for those under the age of 40. Now, does that wash with what you're experiencing, what you're seeing, what your colleagues are experiencing? Does that seem to be how this virus is playing out?
Yeah, absolutely. We're definitely seeing people with the worst outcomes are definitely the people over 70. And one thing that I'll tell you this year, especially seeing and comparing this year to other years where we normally have a flu epidemic, which we don't have this year, there's a huge difference in the population that I'm seeing coming in with flu-like illness, right? So SARS-CoV-2 or COVID is now our flu-like illness of this year. It's the dominant virus this time. So normally, I normally have a large amount of children who come into the hospital, honestly on death's door with influenza. Like they are often, it's rare for them to die, but it's often that they get very sick and often need resuscitation when they come into the hospital. And I'm seeing next to none of that. And that's being seen in the statistics across the board. Children are doing really well this year because COVID is not very dangerous to them at all. Children actually have a low expression of the ACE2 receptor. So the ACE2 receptor is basically what's the virus attaches to and allows it to invade our cells. And children have very low expression of that receptor, and and the expression of that receptor goes up significantly with age. So that's a major part of the reason why children are minimally affected. And not only that, but they also are not great vectors of spread. So they often don't spread it to others. In most cases where contact tracing has been investigated, they found that there have been next to no transmission from children to parents. It's almost always from parents to children. So yeah, I'm definitely seeing this virus is very basically the severity definitely correlates with age, and unfortunately that is not being reflected in the restrictions that we have on our population. Like children are being treated as if they're just as infectious as adults, which they're not. They're not at risk, and actually one of the safest places to be is in schools. Even with no restrictions, even with no masks, children do really well, and there's very few teachers who've been seriously harmed by COVID in schools. So I think that is science, right? Like that we have science, we have data on this age correlation. I think that needs to be reflected in the way that we respond to this virus.
You know, the reason I'm very careful in the way I talk about that is that when I was in mainstream media, there was a Broadcast Standards Council complaint against me because I said exactly that influenza was more dangerous to those under the age of 18 than COVID-19, just because it seemed to be that's what the stats showed. And yet it didn't stop someone from launching a Broadcast Standards Council complaint to say that I shouldn't do that. So let me just loop back around and do another circle here with Dr. Dennis Modry. So if this is the case, if we are seeing that this disease manifests very differently depending on different age groups, why don't we deal with the most at-risk group first? So those over the age of 70, those with multiple pre-existing conditions. In Alberta, the stats show 3 or more pre-existing conditions and being over age 70 are the highest death rates. What should have been the right approach when we started seeing those numbers, and that was becoming clear all the way back to March, even with the stats coming out of Wuhan, certainly with the stats coming out of Italy, it was beginning to be very clear that that was who the most at risk was. If there had been a proper public health approach, what would they have done differently, Dr. Modry?
Well, it's a great question, and it was central to the open letter that I drafted to the Premier, because the essence of learning is that you change the way you think about things, or you do things different based on new information. Well, last year at this time, there was a lot we didn't really know, particularly as we were getting daily feed from what was going on in Italy, etc. And it was estimated at that time that the mortality rate was 3.5%. Well, we now know that it's more like 0.01%. So it was widely overestimated, and that caused fear. But over time, we learned a lot. We learned who the at-risk population was. We learned what the comorbid conditions were. And that gave confidence to start lifting some of the restrictions. Now, with this perceived second wave that was coming, as a result, governments once again overreacted. They didn't understand, and they still obviously don't understand, that if they had done nothing, exactly the same thing would have happened, but we would have solved this problem a lot quicker. So every time you have a lockdown, you delay herd immunity. And the rationale for that was, well, we're going to delay until the vaccine is ready. Well, no. So what I was hoping for with respect to our current provincial government was that they would have learned from the Great Barrington Declaration and the evidence that was coming out against lockdowns and social distancing and masks, and there was a lot of that, because my letter came out on December the 11th, and a lot of the material that I provided was within a month to 2 months of drafting that letter. Some of that information I provided was within a few days. So why? You ask a very important question. Why did the government not take into account that alternative narrative? Well, you could assume it's a matter of cognitive dissonance. They already have fixed in their brain that this is the only thing that we can do. This is the right thing to do. This is what the international community was doing. So it reminds me of a story, and I'll just digress. Just a classic case of cognitive dissonance was in the case of gastric ulcers. It was thought prior to 1982 it was due to hyperacidity. Well, in 1982, two Australian physicians demonstrated it was due to Helicobacter bacterium. Helicobacter pylori, which is a bacterium. So many, many years after, the medical community didn't accept that. So this is 1982. Many years after, they still didn't accept it. Physicians were still treating gastric ulcers and duodenal ulcers as though it was due to hyperacidity. Well, in 2005, those two physicians were awarded the Nobel Prize in Medicine. What does that tell you? So that's a classic case of cognitive dissonance. And it's exactly the same thing that has occurred with governments and our own government here in Alberta. And Patrick, the same thing is happening to you in Ontario. And that is the explanation. But there's one other. And that is that when you've already made a mistake as a government official, it's extremely difficult to come out in front of the public and say, I've made a mistake. We've made a mistake. But I've given Mr. Kenney the opportunity to do that. And it was very interesting because he's one of the few politicians that actually apologized for the lockdowns last spring. But he did it again. So that is a classic case of cognitive dissonance, once again. So I don't know if there's a better explanation I can provide for you as to why these things will persist. But think about this. Viruses mutate. That's why every year there's a new vaccine for the common flu. Well, and the COVID-19 virus is mutating as well. It's going to mutate every year. So if governments keep doing the same thing, we can expect masks, social distancing, and lockdowns forever, which is absolutely insane.
Okay, Dr. Modry, I got to stop you there. We all did a collective gasp when you said that, thinking that we'd never get out of this. Hopefully you'll give us some hope by the end of it that we might be able to change the hearts and minds
at the end of the tunnel.
All right, let me go over then to Dr. Hodkinson, and if we find you cutting in and out, we'll just get you to ditch your video again to see if it works any better. But maybe you can give us your thought on why it is that there seems to be this medical consensus. I think, to build on what Dr. Modry said, I think someone challenged Einstein at one point, saying, "Oh, but all these other physicists disagree with you. It's the majority of them do." He says, "What does it mean? What does it matter if it's a majority? All it would take is one." It would just take one person to overturn my theory if they happen to be right. And yet we don't seem to have that attitude in medical science. It seems like the innovators and the ones who are experimenting and the ones who are prepared to go out on a limb, if they don't fit with a narrative or a mainstream idea, then they're actually shouted down, which is not what I expected. So do you have some thoughts on why that is? I think we still have you on mute there, Dr. Hodkinson.
There's been no due diligence done on this matter from the get-go anywhere. It was Ferguson, Professor Ferguson at Imperial College London, who, by the way, is not a physician. He's a theoretical physicist who was notoriously wrong with his previous projections from other epidemics. His projections for his computer modeling, as he called it, nonsense in, nonsense out is a better description, projected an Armageddon that was coming in everyone's direction. No one did due diligence on this idiot's projections, who was notoriously wrong many, many times previously. Then there was a simultaneous adaptation of measures internationally based upon simply everyone else is doing it. There has been no consensus in the scientific literature or the medical literature that any of these interventions work, period. The mass literature is replete with failed attempts to show that it stops the transmission of flu. Fauci was saying the masks weren't necessary last year and earlier on this year. Masks don't work. The Danish study proved that. Masks have basically, this whole mask idea is based upon two situations. One is, I'm wearing a mask and I don't want to get COVID. Well, the Danish studies showed quite clearly that that does not. Mask is, I've got COVID and I don't want to give it to you. Well, you know what? When we had the flu in previous years and we felt sick, we stayed home ourselves. We didn't need testing. No one told us what to do. We stayed home. We were very responsible. And we didn't visit Granny. And we went back to work when we felt well with no testing at all. It was personal responsibility. So this whole thing has morphed into a monster of politics playing medicine with absolutely no consensus that any of these interventions work at all. Social distancing is merely an extension of masks. Lockdowns, Dr. Ari Yofe showed conclusively that the adjusted lives lost is 5 to 10 times the benefit. And lockdowns, of course, had never been tried before anyway. Lockdowns are a colossal idea. And as Bhattacharya said, the Great Barrington Declaration, it's the biggest mistake that's ever been made in public health. It's of that gigantic. Nothing works. Politicians have got to get their head around the fact, I'm talking as a pathologist now, this is everywhere. You cannot control it. You have to accommodate to it in practical ways, like we did with the flu in previous years. It's as simple as that. This matter is being made so enormously complex for no medical reason. The colleges are claiming that anyone that speaks a counter-narrative is basing it on hearsay, and they have the facts. Well, there are no facts in this matter. That's a grotesque lie. There are no facts. These are arbitrary measures introduced by politicians because they have to be seen to be doing something to save their backsides. Anything, so long as it's visible. And then they bring down the dogs to make sure it's enforced, with all kinds of consequences. Cancelled surgeries, cancelled cancer investigations, cancelled holidays, weddings, funerals, people not being allowed to hold the hand of a dying relative, schools being closed, children losing a year of their lives of education, bankruptcies by the thousands. These consequences are outrageous. And as I said earlier on, if I practiced medicine like that and I was causing much more harm than good, and if I was advocating treatments that were reckless, not being fully tested, I would be in danger of losing my license. So please tell me why it's any different for a medical officer of health for whom the patient is actually society. Medical officers of health in this country are doing exactly that. They are practicing. It's as simple as that. They're getting away with it because they can't be prosecuted. And because their political masters are telling them that they want something done.
Dr. Hodkinson, I want to get Dr. Phillips to respond to that, because I guess that's where I'm confused. Is maybe it's because I'm a former politician that you're going to think that I'm defending politicians. But it seems to me that it's the medical officers of health that are driving this. And it seems to me that the clampdown on anyone who offers an alternative view is coming from your college professional body saying to you that you're not allowed to have an opinion that differs from the chief medical officer. And then it's further exacerbated by the likes of Sundar Pichai and Jack Dorsey and Mark Zuckerberg, who say anyone who says anything contrary to Dr. Anthony Fauci, we're going to deem that misinformation, and we're going to eliminate those videos from YouTube and various other platforms. And then once that happens, the mainstream media doesn't cover it, because you have to figure, gosh, if it's so crazy that those three tech giants won't even allow it to air, we can't possibly air it on mainstream media. But to me, all roads go back to the chief medical officers of health, who've been given absolute power through the Public Emergency Act. And why are they doing this? I mean, I think Dr. Hodkinson thinks that they're getting directed by their politicians. It seems to me it's the reverse. It's that the medical officers are directing the politicians to fall into line. And it's perplexing to me. I don't quite understand how we develop this and why your profession works that way. Do you have some thoughts on that, Dr. Phillips? I don't want to get you in trouble with your college, but you must be seeing the same things that I'm seeing. And I'm perplexed. And I thought maybe you could shed some light on what's happening.
Yeah, absolutely. Like we recently here in Ontario, we had Doug Ford come out and say that he will absolutely not disobey his chief medical health officer. So he said that would be political suicide. And I think that was I don't know if he knew he was on camera at that moment, but it was a very honest moment when he said that. At the same time, just a few months ago, we had our chief medical officer, Dr. Brian Williams, and his deputy, Dr. Yaffe, say that they're not sure why they even bring the papers in front of them, because they read whatever they put on the teleprompter for them, and that's a recorded video that went out there. So the question is, who's writing these scripts for them, right? So who's really calling the shots? And to be honest, I don't know, but there's somebody who's writing those scripts, right? And there's definitely some people in the back rooms who are kind of making those decisions. But ultimately, both are a problem. So the chief medical officers of health, they're unaccountable. They aren't subject to the same restrictions that I would be as a doctor. We've had medical officers of health here ordering parents in Ontario, if another student in that class, in their child's class, was tested positive they are obligated under a fine of $5,000 per day to bring that child home and lock them up in a room with no parental contact for 14 days. And the fine can go up to $70,000, $5,000 per day. And it's a giant scandal. Like, if I ever did that, I would have my license revoked immediately. But these rules do not apply to public medical officers. And we had them kind of renege on that part way, but it was an official document that was put out by these officers. The other part is that, yeah, the politicians seem to be using them as a bit of a scapegoat, but ultimately we elect MPPs here in Ontario and a premier, and they're the ones who are in charge, and so they need to start taking responsibility for this. But also, we need to have regulations in place that nobody should be able to do this. State mandated child abuse should never even be possible under our Constitution. When we invented a Constitution for this reason, because politicians get run away and they feel like they need to do something to solve a problem. And if there's no limits on that power, they're going to feel the obligation psychologically to do something. And that's why we have constitutions, so that they're not even able to do that. To take away people's personal freedom, their freedom to raise and love their children in a normal way, is unthinkable. And that's why throughout the Western world, we establish constitutions that governments don't have even the power to do that. And so I don't know what happened to the Constitution in this country, but we need to bring it back.
No kidding. Let me go back to Dr. Modry. Maybe you can comment as well on what consequences there could potentially be for doctors who do speak out. I mean, I just want to give everybody background, because they know I've been darn frustrated by all of this, and it was one of the main reasons why I left radio. But I contacted John Carpe with the Justice Center for Constitutional Freedoms. I said, I'm having a devil of a time finding doctors who will come on my show. And so he pre-indemnified doctors, saying that if your college comes after you, you already have legal counsel and will represent you. And so he connected me with 5 or 6 different doctors on that basis. But some of them still came forward and said, you know what? 100% of my salary is paid for by government. I might lose my practicing rights at this hospital. I've got a young family. I can't afford it. And that's shocking to me, actually, that there would be that level of professional discipline. Dr. Modry, can you comment on that?
Well, that's exactly the problem. The hospitals are paid from the government, and physicians are paid from the government, and they work at the pleasure of the hospital administration. And if the hospital administration gets a missive from government that they don't like what this particular physician or surgeon is saying, it doesn't look like government is firing them. It's the hospital administration that lets them go. But let me get back to something, because there is a way in which physicians with an alternative view can get the ear of government. And an example of that is in the U.S. Senate, when Bhattacharya and a number of other physicians spoke to the U.S. senators regarding the use of ivermectin and hydroxychloroquine, vitamin D, et cetera, et cetera. And guess what's happened? They're all now available. CDC has approved them. Okay. So now here in Alberta, and I don't know, Patrick, if it's happening in Ontario at all, but there's a number of UCP MLAs that would like to hear from Dr. Hodkinson, from Dr. Ari Jaffe, Mr. Redmond, myself, and perhaps others. But from the top, it appears as though that opportunity doesn't exist. But I think the 4 or 5 of us would love the opportunity in front of caucus to debate Dr. Hinshaw and her colleagues who have an opposing view. And you're right, the government has the responsibility to make a final decision. But as you know, we make our best decisions based on having the best available information. And it isn't good enough for Dr. Hinshaw's group to say, well, that evidence or this evidence, which is contrary to their thinking, is unsupported or lacks scientific veracity, etc. Let the people who, like ourselves, who feel as though there is veracity, to take that research and debate with in front of caucus, so that those people who are responsible for what happens in this province can hear both sides from the experts from both sides. Even if we have to bring in somebody from Germany or from Stanford or Harvard to have that debate with us. But that's the way, that's one way it could be done. But what's happening is government is only getting a one-sided narrative, and that's their collective cognitive dissonance. And it's maddening. It's maddening because many of us can't get, as you've said, through to the mainstream media because they don't want to hear something that's counter to the narrative that they've been pushing all along.
Let me ask Dr. Hodkinson if he has another observation about, because you've been doing international media as well. Is there anything that you've seen that has created a bit of a breakthrough in political thinking elsewhere? I mean, we mentioned Dr. Pierre Corey and others giving the presentation to the Senate. There was also Dr. Bhattacharya and Dr. Martin Koldorf, as well as Sunetra Gupta and Dr. Scott Atlas. That was the latest last week. Governor Ron DeSantis held a follow-up press conference, and he made them available for an hour and a half, just talking it all through. And I've often thought Premier Kennedy needs to do the same thing. I'm just seeing, so we've got a couple of examples. Have you seen any others, Dr. Hodkinson?
Let me just, before Roger, because there's three more things I want to say about this. One is that on January the 25th, a German court has ruled that lockdowns are unconstitutional. So that's number one. So it's like I said earlier, there's going to be a reckoning that's coming. And here's the next one. In June of this year, the Swiss are going to hold a referendum on whether to strip government of its power to impose new lockdowns. And what's even more interesting right now out of Germany, Dr. Reimer Fulmich has, along with, who's a lawyer, who has, along with 24 international lawyers, has started a class action suit against the World Health Organization, the US, Canada, and Germany as a result of the harm that lockdowns have caused. So things are happening now, and provincial governments and federal governments that have been dealing with these lockdowns, have been shoving it down people's throats. They may well be caught up with this class action lawsuit. It's going to be very interesting to see. And that's one thing that gets the attention of people, is if they're being sued.
Right, and class actions could potentially contain damages. And so when you've got dollars associated with it, that could also be a lot more serious. So Dr. Hodkinson, any thoughts that you might have on how to get the message through to politicians, at least that there is this other perspective?
The drivers of the current mess are two. Asymptomatic testing with a massive that's hyped in the morning newspaper with a climbing graph and variants of this and that allows the politicians the reason to down on the madness that's already happened. The second driver, though, is insidious. The three sources of information that people typically rely upon for information are politicians, journalists, and physicians. All three groups are being viciously internationally suppressed. Journalists are having their YouTube channels taken down. I've done a number of interviews internationally, but their YouTube channels taken down. But physicians are the most respected of information, and the colleges are doing everything they can to suppress physicians everywhere internationally, me being one of them. They're not going to succeed because of two reasons. Number one, it's my right to stand up as a free individual to speak my mind. I have been knowledgeable, but remember, no one is knowledgeable in all the many detailed facets of this matter. What's needed is a generalist to review the scene and step back and give a global assessment of what's going on. The colleges are basically there to protect the public good. The doctor's not a paedophile and there's no malpractice going on, etc., etc. Well, I would say to the colleges this: look, if your job is to protect the public good, then you shouldn't be asking me to justify why I'm saying what I am saying. It is your job as a college to demand of government why they are doing this, because the hurt is vastly more than the benefit. And the vaccine is reckless. They're not asking those questions of government, and that should be one of their primary responsibilities. And they're not doing it. Why? Arm of government. They're saluting in their general direction on every issue of public import. Tobacco, totally silent, nowhere to be found. They're simply an arm of government, all dressed up as trying to protect the public good, but they're not demanding those answers from government. They're shrinking from their responsibility, and that too is medical negligence, because that's what they're charged to do.
Dr. Hodkinson, thanks for that. I think it's journalistic negligence for the journalists, the fourth estate, not to be asking more questions and giving more doctors this kind of platform, because otherwise you're just going to end up with a skewed perception in the public. Let's then go to Dr. Phillips and see, are you seeing anything happening in Ontario? Is there, I'm going to actually be interviewing on Thursday the members of the Liberty Caucus. So there are a handful of politicians stepping up, but heck, they're getting deplatformed too. They're getting kicked out of caucus and they're being depicted as being fringy. And so that's the other part of the problem, is that if you want to be a team player as a politician, you have to keep your mouth shut. But are you seeing any movement in Ontario to do the kind of things that we've seen Governor Ron DeSantis do, or the Senate do, where they're bringing forward alternative views so that the politicians can get educated? Anything happening like that, Dr. Phillips?
So yeah, so we're in a bit of a political conundrum here, because much like Alberta, our government is in name progressive conservative, but and so the opposition is only the NDP. So both parties fully support lockdowns. So the only people who have had the bravery to stand up to Doug Ford and to ask for different opinions, or to suggest that we might pick a different course, have been booted out of caucus. So Randy Hillier, Roman Baber, and Cara Helios have all been booted out. And to be honest, I'm seeing on social media they're gaining a lot of support, because I think even among the base of the Conservative Party, people are not feeling at home at all. I mean, most conservatives care about personal liberties and freedoms, right, along with their health. And so I think we're seeing a lot of grassroots movement moving in that direction, and it's slowly trickling up to politicians as well. But I would say it's slow. It's slow, and it's. But I think it's happening because we're seeing that Liberty Caucus grow pretty quickly, and so I'm really hopeful that there will be some big changes coming.
Let me then address some of the science issues. Dr. Hodkinson has already given us his perspective on a few of the contentious issues. I own a restaurant. I wear a mask when I get within someone's personal space. I wear a mask when I go grocery shopping. I've just sort of gotten used to it now. It seems to me it's almost a symbol to everyone around you that you're taking the virus seriously. And so whether it works or not, you don't want to draw attention to yourself as being a social misfit. So I think that there is some kind of there's obviously social pressure to put it on. I was concerned about wearing masks because of Dr. Anders Tegnell in Sweden saying, if you're wearing the mask, same mask over and over, or if you're constantly touching your face, or if you're handling food and things that other people are handling and not washing your hands afterwards because you think you have this mask on and you're protected, you're actually defeating the purpose. And his contention was that it might actually lead to more spread. So I think that there's obviously different perspectives on this. But Dr. Modry, we've heard Dr. Hodkinson weigh in on saying masks don't work. What's your view on it?
No, I totally agree with Roger. Certainly the Danish study was persuasive, but one of the interesting studies was in the Journal of Applied Physics, and it was a very interesting study with different types of masks, including N95 masks. And if you looked at the respiratory patterns with particles, the way they did it was quite brilliant. The mask didn't do anything. It was squirting out the side, squirting out the top, squirting out the bottom. It was just a waste. And Dr. Hodkinson is quite correct. There is absolutely no evidence. There's no study that provided the evidence that masks will do anything to reduce the prevalence or the incidence of transmission. So it truly is virtue signaling. And I mean, I thought it was a very impressive exchange between Ron Paul and
Dr. Fauci.
Dr. Fauci the other day, and I'm sure you guys saw that. And rather than virtue signaling, Mr. Paul used the term theater. Mr. Fauci, isn't it just theater when someone's had the COVID-19 and they've been vaccinated and they're wearing a mask, or in your case, 2 masks? Isn't that just theater? Well, he couldn't really defend it because there's absolutely zero evidence to support using masks. And it's the same thing. It's the same thing that we've seen with respect to social distancing. Now they've reduced it from 2 meters to 3 feet. Where's the evidence for either? There is none. So social distancing, just like masks, is a complete waste of time. As Roger has said, this was a long time ago, and I love the term. The genie was out of the bottle a long time ago. The virus has been in circulation. If we had just done nothing, we would be all a lot better off and trillions of dollars wealthier or trillions of dollars less in debt. And all these businesses wouldn't have gone under, and all of the other harmful things that have occurred. This has been, as has been stated, the biggest public health disaster in 100 years. And it's not over.
No.
It's not over.
Let me ask Dr. Phillips to weigh in, because I think there's probably a lot of people who you're challenging, because all we've been told now for the last number of months is we're not allowed to challenge the idea that masks don't work and that social distancing doesn't work. And so I just want to see if we've got a trifecta of agreement here. So what's your view on masks, Dr. Phillips?
Yeah, absolutely. I agree with both of them. There've been RCTs that have been done on masks, especially with influenza, and they found that there was either no difference, or especially in the case of cloth masks, that it actually increased the rate of transmission, likely through aerosolization, right? Of you getting the mask saturated and then spreading a fog around. The other thing too, there was another study actually for COVID in Spain, where they studied hundreds, if not thousands, of cases, and they found no association whatsoever with mask use and in the transmission. It was only linked to the viral load of the person who spread the disease. But yeah, so like the masks, there's no proof they work for viral illnesses. They're used in hospitals by surgeons, or even if you're in the emergency department, you'll sometimes wear a mask for a procedure, right? And that's more for bacterial transmission. You don't want to spit or get saliva or something into an open wound. That's basically what they're used for in the hospital. Right. Using them to prevent viral transmission is completely new. And there's no evidence that they work for that. And the reason is just because if often virals bioparticles are transmitted in an airborne way. So it forms a little cloud around you. You breathe them out. And so the best thing you can do is actually have good ventilation and be outdoors, right? Where basically the air gets cleared out, and that helps to prevent transmission that way. But yeah, the masks themselves, and especially surgical or cloth masks, are useless.
Oh my goodness. Okay. So people have to digest what they've just heard there, because of all the things that I think are going to stay once everyone who wants to be vaccinated is vaccinated, I think it's social distancing and masks and hand washing. I think that those three things are here to stay. So some of you can comment on whether my observation is accurate on that. But let me go to Dr. Hodkinson again, because people want to have more conversation about vaccines. And I should just tell you my bias going in. My bias going in is that I'm pro-vaccine. And I'm not going to take this particular one, though, because I'm a 49-year-old woman. I've got no pre-existing conditions. I've seen the health profile and recovery rate for those who get COVID. I happen to believe, because I was one of those kids who went to chickenpox and mumps parties, that getting the disease itself probably confers longer-lasting immunity. So I've got a rationale for why I don't want to get the vaccine. If I was over 75, I might make a different choice. So, Dr. Hodkinson, let me push it to you, because you've raised some concerns about the experimental nature of this vaccine, and it hasn't gone through the same amount of testing of usual jabs. So just give us some guidance on that, because I think a lot of the politicians have kind of now got us to a point where the vaccine is the savior, that it's once enough people get vaccinated, we get our lives back. So tell us why you think that might not be the case. Sorry, Dr. Hodkinson, you're still muted again. You'll just have to unmute yourself there.
Yes. They're using not our savior. They introduced all these ridiculous restrictions with absolutely no evidence in medicine to do so. They're getting the heat from doing so. And now they're saying, we'll only take the dogs off if you're stupid enough to take this experimental vaccine. They're merely changing the game to get themselves off the hook. It's as simple as that. We don't need this vaccine. It's unnecessary. It should certainly be voluntary, and it should never be forced on pregnant women and children. It's a reckless, massive medical experiment that may well work very successfully. But the history of vaccines is rather disturbing. You can have all kinds of unusual complications coming out of the woodwork a couple of years later. We just don't know. So it should not be used because, first of all, it's not necessary. There are ways of protecting, and vaccines may be have increased danger for elderly people. So yeah, that's my position on they're just changing the game. And I think that's despicable. To get off the hook, forcing people to take the vaccine is absolutely despicable.
I see why you framed it the way you have. Let me just get you to elaborate a bit more on the not necessary part, because I do want to have a conversation about therapeutics. We did a full 2-hour conversation with Dr. John about some of the promising treatments. But is that why you would say it's not necessary? Is because there are emerging effective therapeutics that if you do get COVID and you get treated with the therapeutic early, you don't progress to the worst form of the disease?
Yes, I'm. But they're certainly not needed for the working well, who are going to shake it off just like you do an ordinary flu. For the elderly in nursing homes, which are already essentially self-quarantined, there are ways of controlling that, as I said, with infection control mechanisms that are well described. If people are sick enough to go to hospital and some of these new drugs turn out to be effective, I think it's fantastic. Obviously, I'm very much in favor of that. But more important than anything is to try and prevent from occurring. And there's a substantial body of evidence now, particularly in the UK and Spain, has an extremely powerful protective role. against getting severe COVID and is useful for people that have severe COVID. It's not being implemented widespread, although many doctors are taking it. I certainly do. 5,000 international units a day is shown to be a most powerful boost of the immune system, which helps to ward off the potential of getting a severe infection. So there's it can be done. Some mistakes were made earlier on with ventilators in New York, adding to the death rate there. But I think it's very, when you're looking at these statistics, not to go cherry picking. You have to look at the global picture and comparisons of things that are sort of different in a significant way, without comparing Finland with Sweden. Sweden has more or less the same stats as the rest of Europe, more or less. There are exceptions, but more or less the same. Look at the difference between California and Florida and Texas. California with its massive shutdowns and mandates and masks, compared with Florida. As I said before, politicians have got to get their head around this, that the virus is everywhere, and we simply have to accommodate to it in practical ways that don't involve the loss of freedoms and don't involve lockdowns and all these other measures. It should be life as normal, as per the Great Barrington Declaration, with only focused protection for the elderly, period. That is it. That's why this thing is so incredibly mad.
Doc, yeah, you did cut out just a little bit. Again, most of what you're saying is very clear, but some people, I think, I just want to make sure that when you said you were taking 5,000 international units, and most doctors are, I took that to mean vitamin D is what you were talking about?
Yes, that's right. Vitamin D, 5,000 international units a day is dirt cheap. It's totally non-toxic. Every Canadian in the winter is vitamin D deficient, guaranteed. What's not realized by the general public is the incredible dual role vitamin D. It's not just with calcium and bone metabolism. It has a totally separate, powerful way of, if you like, toning up the immune system to fight off invaders. It's been extremely well established, and it's not being.
Let me get the other two.
Who refuse to advocate it on a worldwide basis.
You're very right. I mean, I've pressured the government on this as well, and those who are advising the government, and they refuse. They call the discussion of any of these types of therapeutics, once again, fringy. And I think there's got to be nothing more mainstream than taking vitamin D in a northern climate. That seems to be I do that. And it seems like it's a common way for doctors to make sure that their patients stay healthy. But let me get Dr. Modry to weigh in on that. Yeah. Talk to me about your view on these vaccines. Sure. Because I understand it's a controversial issue. I understand that there's grave peril in us even having this conversation and making people vaccine hesitant, and that in itself could cause deplatforming. So I understand that we're just trying to be balanced in this discussion. And so I just want to see what your perspective is on it, Dr. Modry.
Sure. Well, before I tell you what my perspective is, let me tell you about a Gallup poll reported on March the 2nd of 2021. 51% of healthcare workers and first responders in the US are unconvinced of the merits of getting vaccinated. In Switzerland, it's 50%. Germany, it's 70%. In France and India, it's 50% of physicians and nurses and frontline workers are not convinced about taking the vaccine. Now, as far as I'm concerned, I'm happy to take the vaccine as the last person to take the vaccine. It'll probably be J&J.
Can you elaborate on why you like Johnson & Johnson?
Yeah, I don't like needles and it's one shot. No, I'm kidding. It's more than that. It's the way in which that vaccine is prepared. It's not an mRNA vaccine, and it's delivered by a common adenovirus. So that would be my preference if I have to be vaccinated. But but to be honest with you, I think there are so many good therapies now and coming. And one of the most impressive that's coming up, and I know we didn't quite get into that, but for me, it's a reason I would rather get, to be honest with you, I'd rather get COVID-19 and be treated than have any vaccine. Given that I've got a 99.96% probability of surviving COVID-19. But there's a drug called Aplidin, that's the trade name. The generic name is plitidespin. I don't know if you've heard of this, Roger, but it's for the treatment of multiple myeloma. But it's being studied in multiple centers in the US right now, about a dozen. And they finished the phase 2 trials. So far, it appears to be 30 times more effective than remdesivir. So to me, that sounds to me like a virtual cure, possibly, if you get the person treated early enough. So, and I'm sure there's going to be other therapies that are going to come along as well. If there's one thing that COVID-19 has done, is it certainly stimulated a lot of research into viral therapies and rejuvenating that which in the past could have had benefit, like ivermectin and hydroxychloroquine. And there's probably others out there as well, hitherto unknown to me, but still, that's my feeling about the vaccines. And it seems like almost 50% of the medical profession, including nursing and physicians, according to that Gallup study, feel exactly the way I do, rather reticent to take the vaccine.
Dr. Phillips bailed out. I thought maybe he didn't want me to ask him this question.
I'm not an anti-vaxxer. I just want to say I'm not an anti-vaxxer, just not for me.
Got it. And I mentioned why I didn't think I would be the best candidate. I don't mind waiting either. I don't think that it's something that necessarily would be optimal for me either, for the reasons I said. But let's go to Dr. Phillips. Tell me the kind of advice that you're giving to your patient on these various vaccines.
Yeah, so I mean, that's a difficult one. I agree. Like I have concerns about these vaccines. I'm pro-vaccine. I've had all of my vaccines and many more. But what sets these vaccines apart is the development time. Like vaccines are usually developed over years and years. Because it's not like a drug, right? So when you get the injection of the vaccine, it produces an antibody that ideally is designed to be in you for life. And that antibody is the drug. And so that is a long-term treatment that's going to be with you for the rest of your life. And when you're giving a long-term treatment like that, you need long-term data on what the side effects are. And so a lot of these vaccines were only tested over months, right? And they were given emergency use authorization prior to the normal approval process that other vaccines go through. And I find that concerning. If I'm going to be recommending a long-term treatment, I think we need long-term independent safety data before we administer those, because like in the Hippocratic Oath, like, or just in medical ethics in general, we vow to do no harm, right? Like, so that's the first thing that we do. At the very least, don't harm people. And so we need to know that we're giving treatments that it's not going to harm them. And I don't think you can give a long-term treatment without long-term data. And so that's my philosophy around these vaccines. They may very well prove to be safe at some point, but I think we need to have the data on that before we can make that judgment.
I do have a number of people saying that the drug companies say that mRNA viruses or vaccines have been in development for years. There's actually a company in Calgary and Edmonton, I think Calgary, Providence has been, they say that they've been working with mRNA vaccines since 2015. So just square the circle for me on that one, because you'll have the drug companies come back and say, no, we've been working on this for years. I'll go to Dr. Phillips on that. Go ahead.
Yeah, so even if mRNA vaccines have been around, I don't think they've definitely not been around in general use in the general human population for sure. But regardless, every vaccine is unique. Every one of them is a unique recipe that can have differing impact on our immune system. All you need to do is change a few nucleotides, and it can resemble a human protein, right? And that can cause an autoimmune reaction. So just because mRNA vaccines have been around for a while doesn't mean that these ones have. And so every vaccine needs to be judged on its own merits because each one is unique. And I've heard a lot of talk, like from the drug companies, from governments, that they can just tweak a few nucleotides and adjust to the variants. But no, that is a very unique and completely new drug because it produces a new protein in the body that might interact in a different way with our immune system. So I'm not for hastily developed medical technologies until you have the long-term data, and we definitely should not be updating these and tweaking them last minute, thinking that it's going to be just as safe as previous versions.
Oh my goodness. Okay, we've got to deal with a couple of other topics before I ask you how the heck we're going to get out of this, because having been a former politician, having seen how locked in these politicians are, if anyone goes to them and say, okay, no masks, no social distancing, no hand washing, kids go back to school 100% with all their activities, just do focus protection of the seniors in nursing homes, make sure you got vitamin D and ivermectin on hand, I'm pretty sure we're just going to be told no. And so I want to see if there's a political path forward on this that will allow us to see the end of the light. But first, or the light at the end of the tunnel. First, let me ask the question about PCR tests, because I know the politicians know this. I started seeing BBC and New York Times reports on this going all the way back to September. So I tried to stay in the mainstream media when I was reporting on the air. And they said that the problem is with these cycle thresholds, that if you amplify the viral particles too many times, it can't tell the difference between a live virus and a dead viral particle. And what's more, it can stay in your blood system for months. And so when I look at all of these PCR tests and I see 10,000 people have gone and got tested, I'm wondering, first of all, who's getting tested just for giggles? Why wouldn't you just get tested if you were sick? But number two, how many of those are false positive because the cycle threshold is set too high? Let me see if I'm on the right track first with Dr. Hodkinson. Is there some other way that we should be approaching the testing? Hodkinson frozen again. Let me go to Dr. Modry first, and we'll see if we can circle back to Dr. Hodkinson when he's unfrozen. Go ahead, Dr. Modry. How do you look at these PCR tests? Have I described it correctly?
Yeah, for the most part, the cycle, the cycles, the number of cycles, the cycle times. So what we know is that if you've got cycle times over 40, you've virtually got 100% false positives, if that's what it takes to diagnose COVID-19. If it's 30 or less, you've got a high probability. I understand that the U of A we're using cycle times of roughly 35. And if that's the case, there's a significant number of false positives that are occurring, which is part of the reason why I raised the question in my open letter to the Premier with respect to diagnosis of people in the general population who are asymptomatic versus people who are admitted to hospital versus people who are admitted to the intensive care unit. And I'm assured that the people who have tested positive for COVID-19 based on a PCR cycle time that the U of A is using is giving an accurate diagnosis. Personally, I don't believe that because if they're using cycle times of 35, I would suggest that you could come into the hospital with an arrow through your head and you'd have a PCR study done with a cycle time of 35, and they'd say, yeah, you've got COVID-19. So I mean, this is the ridiculousness of it. So you can't, I personally just can't believe the numbers that are being reported by Alberta Health. And it's fundamentally based on, because it is based on a flawed test. And that, incidentally, is the genesis of that international class action suit, is the PCR test. That's what they're focusing on as the first item to attack with respect to the lockdowns, etc. So and I can't get a clear answer, but I did get as close to an answer as I can today, and it appears as though the cycle times are around 35 at the University of Alberta, and it's probably throughout Alberta as well, wherever they're doing PCR tests. But Roger is really more of an expert on this than I am, and I'm sure Patrick would have something to say.
Perfect. Let me ask both of them to weigh in. I think we got you back there, Dr. Hodkinson. So okay, if you can get a reasonably accurate result at a cycle threshold of 18, then why not just have a mandate that you move the cycle threshold down to 18 so that we can have some confidence? It seems like there's a way to salvage this test, or maybe not. What would be your approach to testing? Dr. Hodkinson.
No, there is no way of salvaging a lousy test. There is no way of salvaging this lousy test. The whole essence of it is how many true positives you want to pick up, recognizing that if you don't do enough cycles that you'll be missing some. The opposite theory is being applied. We'll amplify the hell out of this to make sure that we don't miss a single case. But by doing so, you will have a huge number of false positives in people who are asymptomatic, in the 70 to 90% range. My estimate in Alberta, using the government's own statistics, is that they have approximately a 70% false positive rate for people who are asymptomatic and are testing positive. That has a huge multiplier effect on the workforce, because each one of those false positives takes out 10 more people. You have a 10 times multiple of this monstrously inaccurate test in the first place. The way this test is done is so exquisitely sensitive to technique. You cannot pull a tech off reading pap smears or doing chemistry and put them in front of this machine and ask them to do it effectively. The minutiae of how this is done in the trade is well known. And it's also well known that when you try and ramp it up into hundreds, if not thousands of times more tests than you did last year, you're roping in people who haven't a clue how to operate this machine. And so you get a massive number of false positives. But that's beside the point. This test is not needed in the first place. We don't need asymptomatic testing. It has no purpose whatsoever, except driving hysteria and giving politicians an extra reason to double down. The only testing that's needed is when people present to hospital with sufficiently severe disease that you're considering admitting them. And then you want a very accurate test. And that test is called DNA sequencing by the Sanger method. He got the Nobel Prize for it. That's how the Genome Project was done. It has ways of internally validating the result. And at a much lower test volume, which that situation implies, it's perfectly feasible to scale up Sanger sequencing as the only test that's done. They have not done that. They're not ignorant of the technology. It just doesn't apply itself to mass testing of the asymptomatic population, which should never be done in the first place. It has no purpose, and it drives hysteria, and it's madly inaccurate.
Let me see if Dr. Phillips, if I can pose a theory about why they want to keep on doing this broad testing. And it's because we keep on having, again, we're sort of victim to these computer models that never pan out. But because there's a 10 to 14 day period where between when you get a positive and when it might manifest in hospitalization, they're trying to get an early indicator of whether their hospital surge capacity is going to get overwhelmed and whether their ICUs are going to get overwhelmed. So if that's the premise for it, is there another way to do that? I mean, I know it sounds maybe a little gross, but I think they do wastewater testing and they can see surges in viral levels just from the pee coming out of college dormitories. Like, it seems to me maybe there's another way to get that early warning sign rather than be disrupting the lives of every family whose kid tests positive because someone in the class ended up getting diagnosed with COVID. And that's happening all over, the kind of disruption that's happening in the schools and the families that are related to that. So let me put it to you, Dr. Phillips, is that a legitimate reason for us to do widespread testing, is to get an early warning sign in the hospitals?
I don't think so, really. I think we need to look at basically the patient who's in front of you, right? So you need to look at the costs and the benefits to the patient in front of you on whether or not you're going to perform a test on them. So there needs to be some sort of a benefit in order to be doing that. And so otherwise it becomes unethical, like to be able to perform tests, and especially to make them mandatory on some people. You need to know that there's a benefit to that person from knowing that. So we have lots of examples of this throughout medicine. If you look at, for example, the PSA test for prostate cancer, there's lots of false positives in that. And so in order to ethically perform that test, rather than trying to use it as a way to predict urology resource use like later in the future from prostate cancer, rather what we do is we look at that patient, what's this test going to benefit you? Because there's a lot of harms that go along with any kind of testing. So in the case of the PSA test, it's going to cause a lot of worry. They might need a biopsy that they wouldn't have needed otherwise, rather than waiting for symptoms. And then what we need to look at and see, did this really improve their lives overall? Did it save lives? And what they found with the PSA test is no, it didn't. So as much as you think catching cancer early is sometimes helpful, what they found is often it did more harm than good. Somebody they found a bloop, like basically an increase in their PSA, and it wouldn't have panned out, wouldn't have harmed their life, but they ended up getting this biopsy that caused damage to their body. But I think the same goes for these PCR tests. And we have to think of the harm that it causes, not only to that person. So think of those children, right, who test positive in schools, like where they're testing thousands and only a few come back positive, which are likely false positives, right, considering the small amount that do that. And then the social harms that come from that child needing to stay home, their family not being able to work. And what was the real consequence? That child was never really at risk, right, of COVID, right? They weren't going to be harmed by it. It's basically a cold for children, right? So I think testing people and subjecting them to the harms of testing, which we really need to discuss, for the benefit of society, can be detrimental, right? And I don't think it follows medical ethics, because we need to look at the person in front of us and is this test going to benefit you? And I'd say for the majority of the population, it wouldn't. The WHO has agreed on this. Actually, they put out in January, they put out a statement saying that they're concerned about false positives and that we should not be diagnosing a case of COVID based on PCR alone. It should be based upon symptoms, like along with a PCR test. And if they don't have any symptoms, you should draw a second PCR test, all with the cycle thresholds less than 30. So we're not even following the WHO guidance. We've gone a little rogue here, and I think this test is being really misused.
Wow. Okay. So, Dr. Phillips, before I go and talk about the broader societal harms, because I see you want to talk about that, and I know that the other docs do too. You're in a hospital. Wouldn't you want to know what the general level of infection is in your region to know if you're going to get hit? Like you'd be the guy who's dealing with this, wouldn't you? Like I'm just wanting to make sure that that it's not giving you any useful information to see case counts. I want to just double check on that, because my goodness, we have been bombarded with case count numbers incessantly from the beginning of this, and you're just telling me that for you as a frontline doctor, you're not finding that the way we're doing it is useful at all. Am I hearing you right?
Well, I mean, there's a little bit of a predictive value towards the hospitalizations with the case numbers. But what we really care about is people who are sick. And so that's going to depend on the age. Like all these positive tests among children or young people, like that's not really that relevant. In the case of the flu, we didn't test the general population. We only tested people who came into hospital. And we did fine with that. It's helpful information within the hospital, so we can isolate people who are sick, right, and to prevent us from spreading it around the hospital. So yeah, it's absolutely helpful for sick people within the hospital for us to know that information. But I think with the general population, I think it does more harm than good. It creates a lot of fear. It's gets people scared. It creates a lot of social stigma. I've had patients who've tested positive for COVID who've been chased out of town. They've had death threats, right? Especially in small towns. People being told, "Get out of our town. How could you bring this virus to us here?" And so that causes harm, and we need to consider that. And there's not a lot of privacy in small towns. I can tell you that in Ontario, people will find out who tested positive. Regardless of confidentiality in the hospital, people have a way of doing that. And so I think when we're performing a test, it needs to be for the benefit of that person and not for the benefit of just society.
All right. I have interviewed Dr. Ari Jaffe on mainstream media. I managed to sneak him in before I left the air, and I actually had him on twice. So I'm very familiar with the different measures that he's looking at. So let me go to Dr. Modry first and just give me your sense of what the harms are likely to be, because we need to know as we're monitoring this over the next year or 3 or 5, maybe you should give us the time frame. What is it we're going to start seeing as the consequences of lockdown? Not I know that there are COVID long haulers, and there's issues that we'll have to deal with long-term from people who haven't fully recovered from it. But I'm talking about those who did not get sick, but suffered the harms because of lockdowns. How's that going to manifest over the next few years? What stats should we be looking at to see what the true level of harm was?
Well, before I answer that, I want to just pose a question. And we'll just leave it as a rhetorical question for the audience. Should we pay for anything in healthcare, any diagnostic or therapeutic procedure that by evidence does not produce a health benefit? And the PCR studies testing asymptomatic people is a waste of money, a waste of time, and is in and of itself a health hazard, as Patrick has just stated. So think about that question. Should we pay for anything in healthcare that by evidence does not produce a health benefit? So that's parenthetic a little bit to the conversation, but there's an opportunity to save enormous funds in healthcare if you applied that principle. Now, with respect to the harm from lockdowns, my goodness, I mean, it stems from everything to marital breakups, to increase in crime, to lost jobs, lost businesses, massive economic disruption, trillions and trillions of dollars of debt. And you know, if you're a conspiracy theorist, this all might be, you know, resulting in what has been termed the Great Reset, whatever that really means. But fundamentally, society has changed as a result, not of COVID-19, but as a result of draconian government interventions. And COVID-19 didn't do this. Government did this to us.
I've got someone saying the feedback is bad once again. I don't know if it's Dr. Phillips or Dr. Hodkinson who's not on mute, but let's just continue on. I'll go back on mute. So Doc, yeah, continue on then. So talk a little bit more then, as you say, whatever harms we're going to see in future. Someone's saying, are you saying we're going to be locked down for 3 years? No, I'm saying that the consequences of lockdowns are going to be felt for at least 3 years or more. And I want you to just sort of elaborate on those things.
Well, I think, you know, if you looked at Ari Jaffe's research, he indicated we've lost 250 million quality adjusted life years. You know, so I think we're going to see the consequence of what has happened as a result, again, not of COVID-19, but as a result of what governments have done to us with these lockdowns for decades to come. I think it's a real serious problem. It's probably, as Bhattacharya said, it's the greatest hoax and on society, and it's caused more harm. I just can't possibly. This would be like a nuclear bomb going off in every city, in my estimation. I mean, this is just probably the worst thing that could happen to society, and our elected leaders are responsible for this, and they will be held to account. And they will be held to account, some of them at the next election, some maybe the election after that. But there will be a reckoning, and it is coming like a freight train.
Let me go to Dr. Hodkinson, because that was the word that you used that made me unable to have you on the air. And it was when you used the word hoax. And the way I took it to mean is, yes, SARS-CoV-2 is real. Yes, COVID-19, the disease is real. But the hysteria surrounding the reportage on it and the government reaction to it is the hoax. Maybe you can, if I misunderstood
That's
you,
correct.
Claire.
That's what I meant.
That's what I thought. So tell me what you think the long-term consequences are going to be of the lockdowns.
It is the biggest hoax ever perpetrated on humanity. It's in a scale all of its own. It is massive, but at a personal level, at a micro level, with all the examples that we've discussed, and at the macro level, with the scale of borrowing, which is unprecedented in human history. People don't understand zeros and billions anymore. Our children will be paying off for this idiocy for the rest of their lives, with increased taxes, with reduced services, devaluation, or whatever mix thereof. It's on that scale of idiocy, and it was all totally unnecessary. I would like to reflect back upon one word that you used earlier on, Danielle, if I may, because it's central to this debate, and it's the word case. Positive tests, most of which are false positives, are not cases. In medicine, we call a case someone who's actually sick. These numbers are being presented to the general population as if these numbers represent sick people. They do not. The vast majority of these people are perfectly well. And it's not surprising that they have recovery, because if you repeat a false positive test, you're going to get a negative test next time. Just because it's negative does not mean that they are recovered. Guess what? They never had the infection in the first place. It's a total misuse of the word, just like the statistics are being misused. You can say that there's an increased risk of death in 75-year-olds with comorbidities that's maybe 4 to 5 times the flu. Yes, that's right. But if I could express those statistics the other way, perhaps that would be more reassuring to the general public. And this is never done. For an individual to say that your risk with disease X is 99%, your risk of your likelihood of surviving is 99% with the flu, whereas it's 96% with COVID. The average person would shrug that off. But it's the statistics are being distorted by saying it's 4 or 5 times more than what it was with the flu. Yes, it was, but it's a very small number to start with. So they're constantly fear-mongering to drive justification for what they're doing. And now, of course, the latest one are the variants. Well, as Dr. Modry said, RNA viruses always mutate. So do flu viruses. And it's nothing new. And even if this variant is more transmissible, that's a good thing. It will mean that there'll be faster herd immunity. Excellent. It's not going to kill people. It's simply going to make it easier to resist next year when another variant comes around. So they're constantly scaremongering to drive fear that then justifies their actions, which themselves have no evidence base in medicine.
Wow.
They're constantly
Okay.
covering their ass.
Well, and so we'll go to a question. I want you to think about it now because I'll come back to you on it. How do we get out of this with all that being a given? Before I do, I just want Dr. Phillips to weigh in on the long-term effects that you're likely to see. Like the stories I used to get when I was on radio were just heartbreaking. I still remember one of my, I think I need Dr. Hodkinson. I might need you to go on mute again. But I think one of the ones that I remember was a grandma who got in touch with me saying that her 10-year-old grandson was terrified that he was going to get sick and die, or that he was going to get sick and transmit it to family members that they were going to die. I just don't know what we're doing to the mental health of our kids.
Yeah, absolutely, and that's something I'm seeing all the time, especially during the worst of the lockdowns. Children are not doing well with schools shut down, and also with all these social distancing measures. Children are like little sponges. They take in all these things, and so and their impressions last for years and decades, and possibly the rest of their lives. So we're teaching kids, right, that they're a danger to others. Others are a danger to them. If you go too close and you hug your friend, you might kill grandma, right? And so they're hearing these things and they're believing them. They will 100% believe them, and especially when we act accordingly, right? We punish normal social behaviors like playing and expressing their faces and talking during lunch, right, which is banned here in Ontario. It's gonna, like, I think that's going to have the biggest consequence in our society, because these children are being traumatized on a massive scale, and they are going to be the people who are running our society someday. And if you want to look at what happens when you have a mass trauma happen to a population, you can just look to China, right? They had the Great Leap Forward, they had the Cultural Revolution, where massive changes happened to society and massive trauma. And what often happens is they adopt a dictatorial lifestyle. Like they view society in a different way, and I think that can have massive consequences for the way that we live our lives. And so these poor children are going to have major mental health issues, and it's going to be difficult to fix. I think it's possible. I think we can turn it around now, but with a lot of work. But that's just touching on the children, right? Because there's just so much more. We have a massively expensive healthcare system. It's been top notch, honestly. We've had a great, wonderful healthcare system, but it costs a lot of money, and that money is gone, right? It's not just like it's already gone. We're running it all off debt, massive amounts of debt, that levels of debt that we've never had before. So I think the fact is, like, the funding for our healthcare system is already gone. It's just the debt's gonna run out at some point, and I think we're gonna see that cancer care, stroke care, heart attacks, ICU, all those things are going to become unaffordable to this country. We need an economy of private businesses. They are the ones who pay for our public healthcare system. And without private business, without small business, without people living their lives as they see fit and generating an economy, we can't have all these public goods that we've enjoyed for decades. And so I think we're going to see some massive changes, massive cuts, and a lot of psychological trauma that's going to manifest over the next few years.
Okay, Dr. Phillips, you've just given me psychological trauma. I'm feeling anxiety here. So we've got to try to give a measure of hope about how we're going to get out of this, because the obvious ways of getting out of it are not, from your perspective, from what we've discussed, not medically sound. It's just theater again. Like, let's have the theater of everyone getting vaccinated, and the theater of still wearing masks, and the theater of continuing some of these restrictions, and the theater of a vaccination passport. But we need to know how we really deal with this, so that the next time a new novel coronavirus or adenovirus or whatever type of virus arrives, we don't have governments doing this to us again. So let me start with Dr. Hodkinson and see if you've got the pathway out, sir. Let us know, please. We're all dying to hear it. Oh, sorry, I made you mute, and now you're still muted. If you could unmute, and I'll go on mute.
I'm not going to give you an out. I'm going to give you a much worse scenario that hasn't been mentioned on and people really need to pay attention to what I'm going to say. The likelihood is, not proven, but probably, that this virus was a result of what's called gain of function experiments, which bizarrely are intended to make a virus more infectious in order to study it and help to treat it in the future. That gain of function research was funded by Fauci against Obama's explicit prohibition. He offloaded it to Wuhan, and in all probability, this was not a China virus, but an American virus that was offloaded for research in China. Now, that's yet to be proven, but the big point is this: gain of function research is the scariest thing for humanity there is, much more serious than nuclear war. You need this technology is not rocket science. A rogue state like North Korea or Iran could do it easily. You can create monster viruses in a laboratory, and that particular lab in Wuhan was notorious for poor biosafety, known by the State Department before Fauci offloaded that research. So the big lesson from COVID, this is a walk in the park compared with what could be unleashed on humanity because of this mad focus on gain of function research. It should stop. There should be an international agreement that it doesn't happen anywhere for any reason whatsoever, because no lab is 100% watertight.
Okay, now you got me even more terrified. Let's see if we can move to see if there's another path forward. I guess this is the thing, is that we did have some recognition that this gain of function research should stop. But is there any authority that would be able to stop it? You'd think that would be something the World Health Organization could do, or if the UN wanted to put itself to a useful purpose, that would be something that they could coordinate. Do you share Dr. Hodkinson's concerns, Dr. Modry? One more. If you could go off mute, Dr. Modry, go ahead.
Yeah, no, I agree with what Roger said with respect to gain of function. Gain of function can be can result in a more virulent virus, no question about it, and it can also result in better understanding of how to treat the virus. So, because that's another function. But he's quite right about the concern to be raised. There is some evidence, and I've seen, I don't know if it was accurate, but viruses in nature can't be patented. There is a patent on COVID-19 in the US. So I think Roger is correct that this did occur. This was developed in the US. There was a tremendous amount of medical pushback to stop the gain of function research. And so with funding from the US that Fauci had received, they moved that research to Wuhan. So Roger is absolutely correct as far as the information I have reviewed as well. So how do we get out? How do we get out from this? Well, I guess probably the only solution is for governments to change their view as to what needs to be done with respect to managing COVID-19 and its variants and future viruses, with a commitment never to do this sort of thing again. And so for the electorate out there in Alberta and throughout Canada, they've got to ask themselves, what government should we elect that will never abrogate our freedoms and rights again? And perhaps if you ask that one question and you look at which parties are running to be elected in the next election, which parties will guarantee, put in a constitution that they will never abridge or abrogate individuals' freedoms and rights like this ever again. I think that's probably one of the only things that that we can do, because government has so much control over our lives, and I don't have any other better solutions. We've already discussed the reality that there are effective therapies and more effective therapies coming down the line. And so I think we need to ensure that governments aren't fear-mongering in the future, and think about who you vote for in the next election.
Great advice. And we will be talking with, as I mentioned, the Liberty Caucus members, all the politicians and independents who are standing up, who are assembling that same kind of strategy. Let me see if there's some more immediate things that we can do, because gosh golly, I don't want to wait 2 years before we have the ability to hold our politicians to account. I actually want our politicians to do the right thing now so they can get reelected. So let me see if Dr. Phillips has any thoughts for us. If you magic wand here, you are now Dr. Theresa Tam, you're Chief Medical Officer of Canada. You are able to issue statements that will be followed by other chief medical officers in all of the provinces. What's the path out of this?
Yeah, so I think something that's really important to understand is how we got into this. And there's some like mass psychology that was used by the media and by politicians that kind of induced us into this hysteria, right, around COVID. And part of that is the daily case counts, the daily death counts every day, right? And so like thousands of people die all the time, right? And we have motor vehicle deaths, we have cancers, all of those. If you announce those every day, right, and said how concerned you were about them, everybody would be terrified of diabetes, terrified of heart failure, and heart attacks and everything, right? Because it's happening on a massive scale to a large amount of the population, right? And so I think what we need to do is we need to turn this trick around a little bit, right? And start to just, along with the COVID case counts, I think just start to introduce the population to those consequences, right? So we need to put up those numbers of the number of suicides every day, the number of bankruptcies, the daily debt count, right? And missed cancer diagnoses, right? And all of those things, just to get into people's minds, not just once, but on the daily basis like they have for the others, to get into people's minds that there are other things going on here. Right? So they might hear about those stats every once in a while, but not in the same way as they are with COVID. And so if you throw something in somebody's face every day, that's what's going to make it so important in their mind. And so we need to provide a balanced perspective. And I think that's something that can happen right away. And it's a way out for these politicians, right? So you just do that slowly. And after a while, people will be like, hey, wait, there's some bigger problems going on here, right? And I think that will get the general population to buy in and to understand that there are bigger problems that are happening than just COVID. And so I think that's the biggest way for the politicians to get out, just to provide that balanced perspective about other things that are happening and the consequences of these actions. And that will eventually get people to understand that these lockdowns are harmful.
All right.
About it. Yeah.
Thank you so much for that. I know there are a few activists. I see their names on the comments feed. So perhaps that they'll be the ones who have to assemble this information. You know where to find me, daniellesmith.locals.com. Ian, if you're listening, and some of the others who like to post information, if you can do that daily count to get the other stats out there, maybe it'll help to educate the public. Well, I don't know if Derek Fildebrand is back. I knew that this was going to be a bit of a downer kind of session, because there isn't a whole lot of great news, because, and I know it's a lot to digest, because you've had to sort of sneak around like I have, going to all the alt sites to try to find some of this information. I am so grateful to all of the docs, Dr. Dennis Modry, Dr. Roger Hodkinson, and Dr. Patrick Phillips, for being courageous enough to come on here, challenge the conventional wisdom, face some of the pushback that they're likely to get from it, just so that you can be better informed. That's what it's all about. We're all just trying to figure the world out. And I hope you tune in on Thursday. Maybe we'll get some advice from the politicians about what the next steps might be. I'm going to hand it off to Derek Filderbrand to finish us off. Derek, take it away.
Thanks so much for guest hosting tonight, Danielle. Absolutely fantastic show. I think we've had record viewership, massive number of comments, so people are clearly engaged on this topic. I apologize. I look like I'm appearing from a dark cave in an undisclosed location somewhere right now. But I want to thank our guests, Dr. Phillips, Dr. Modry, Dr. Hodkinson, and again, you, Danielle, for guest hosting tonight. And I want to thank all of you who have watched tonight for tuning in, educating yourself, and listening to these dissenting but very credible voices. I know I learned a lot tonight, and at least I think I'm a little bit smarter for it. So thank you all very much for tuning in. Remember, if you're not yet a member of the Western Standard, we need you to support independent, government bailout-free media. There's the Western Standard. There's a lot of other budding independent media outlets out there. Please consider supporting at least one of them. My preference is that you support the Western Standard, though. You can go to westernstandardonline.com/membership, sign up, get the first 15 days for free, see if you like what we're putting forward here. If you like it, then continue on as a member. And again, thank you to our sponsor today, chironsway.com. Chiron's Way is a great way to deal with your stress during some pretty stressful times in a very natural and non-medicated, non-pharmaceutical way. So for more information, check out chironsway.com. Again, thank you all very much for joining us tonight. Appreciate your time. Have a good evening. God bless.